Hi, my name is Michelle Applegate, and this is Unit 16.2. We all happen to pick the same Horizon report, the 2020 EDUCAUSE Horizon report for Teaching and Learning Edition. And it had 4 different scenarios, which worked out great because there were 4 of us. So we just divided it amongst that each of us had a scenario to talk about and kind of summarized for this discussion. These 4 scenarios are different hypothetical alternative ways for envisioning 4 different ways that the future might look with different education transformations and changes and things that might happen. And each one of them has different pros and cons and different abilities of what you think might actually happen. And we also included the 2020 Horizon report, that the ISTE standards that would be covered by this particular Horizon report. The Horizon report the scenario that I covered was called the growth scenario. And in it, they talked about just general growth across secondary and upper higher education across the country, and that the growth wasn't uniform, but was pretty standard across their different progress was made on equity and inclusion. It wasn't perfect. Some areas were better than others, but across the board, generally, there was more progress made. They focused on skills that were directly relevant to what the industry wanted and what jobs were out there and what things were going to happen. They talked a lot about the difference, how climate change, the effect that climate change and the internet both would have on higher education, that in this scenario, both types, the online education, the things that were transformed because of different kinds of things in the climate and political arena, would become more involved and more standard, but then also the traditional residential colleges and universities would survive. Those that adapted or had the funds to change had more likelihood to survive this kind of change than those that were financially in constraints to begin with, that some didn't survive, but that the higher education, the way we think of it today, traditionally did survive. But then there was also a huge growth in the online and internet-based and data-based educations that were out there. And so that was the growth scenario and what would happen by the year 2030 in this particular hypothetical scenario.
Okay, the scenario I read was the constraint scenario, which basically talks about how higher education will continue, but with a diminished role. There would be a worldwide failure to respond to global climate change and environmental depletion, which would increase the need for a restraint in material and energy consumption. So this will cause higher education institutions to have escalating financial pressures because of shrinking enrollments and decreased government funding. So institutions would have to get rid of things like sports programs that are not bringing in any profit, and they would funnel those funds into esports. Students would be pushed to finish their degree programs quickly, and online courses would become the default mode for course delivery. So that institutions would not waste resources. Programs would be developed to make enrollment selections and scholarship allocations for students. And if they found that students were underperforming, they would be asked to choose either another learning path, or they would be asked to withdraw from the institution altogether. Faculty would be told to only teach what is needed and applicable. But the good thing about that is they feel like that it would increase the public's confidence in regards to course efficacy. There would be some good and some bad, obviously, that come from the scenario. Higher education would be able to cut out things that were considered wasteful, which would eventually create a path for sustainability for them. It would cause less expensive modes of learning, and attitudes about higher education would eventually shift to a positive direction. On the other hand, higher education institutions would no longer be able to offer things that it once could. And so industries would have to fill in those gaps with job-based trainings. and allowing potential hires to demonstrate mastery in particular areas.
So the collapse scenario focuses on a future in which higher education collapses and is replaced what we call the new ecosystem of education. So the collapse of higher education, we know, is due to economic reasons. The increase of the cost of higher education creates a gap between like the price of the degree and the ability for students to be able to pay for that degree. Funding coming from like federal subsidies and the state are unable to close the gap. So due to this, there's not enough enrollment for students. Not a lot of students are paying to be able to attend these classes. And so many departments begin to be eliminated, and especially in like humanities. So institutions later begin to close and they disappear, like they start closing because there's not enough enrollment for these programs. And so learners and future workers see that completing a degree is less important, and they need to provide more evidence of skills to be able to be hired at these jobs. You know, they need to get a job, so they notice that they need, you know, evidence of the skills to be able to apply. And so this is where like corporations, so like this is like the future of like corporations and government. So they begin to replace like these accredited colleges and universities and begin to train these like future workers and provide them the skills. And that way they could continue their learning through their careers.
And I had the transformation scenario where there were really like three models that this scenario outlined. The first with the time delimited enrollment, in which in higher education, you would specify during a time frame. So maybe it was a 3 to 6 year time frame you were allotted for your higher education. So maybe you didn't finish in 4 years, or maybe after 4 years you wanted a few more courses to take, that your higher education would be based off of a time frame. The second one was more like a learner for life, is what I took that model as you, whatever school you were in or the higher education institution you were in, you were committed to learning. And if you several years down the road into your career decided that you wanted a new certification, or maybe you wanted to boost your skills with the changing world, you could go back whenever you wanted to. And then the last one was a subscription-based higher education, which I found interesting, where you would basically pay a monthly subscription to continue learning and to receive those certificates in that higher education. Now, the future of transformation, this whole scenario of 2030, was interesting with the degree alternatives, which I've kind of feel like we're already headed in that direction in 2022 with alternative programs based off of skill and certifications versus just college courses. And then just to bring in cost also, like Melanie talked about, where this scenario brought in the idea of institutions also coming alongside higher education and the scholarship piece at the cost. And then just the last thing I wanted to note here for the transformation, which I found interesting, was this prediction in this hypothetical scenario of every student having an AI companion headed into higher education. And I was like, whoa, what if I had this artificial intelligence with me as I'm going through school? Like, what would that look like? What does that look like for the students that are currently in my class if this were to be the trajectory of education right now? So with our 4 scenarios that we've discussed here, do we have any final thoughts as a group from this Horizon report?
I have to say, I like the being able to be a life learner. For someone who changed their major 5 times, I think it is awesome.
Or go back to college at the age of 49. Yeah.
Right. To be able to go back whenever you feel the need, or if you know, life happens, you get in there, you decide you don't want to do it, it's not working for you. I think that would be great to be able to go back, you know, and do something else.
I do think some of these scenarios kind of underestimate the what a lot of kids, I hate to say kids because they're adults technically, but what a lot of people go to college for isn't just to get a degree, it's the experience. And so like the elimination of the sports that don't bring in revenue and the elimination of unnecessary classes and that kind of stuff, I think that the Horizon reports are underestimating the push that alumni and moneyed people would have behind keeping those in place in our, what's the traditional university experience right now.
Right.
When I look at my college age kids, why do they want to go to college? Some of it's just to have that college experience. That's a huge part of college. And the higher education in our country, yes, we're getting degrees and we're getting job training, but you're also getting life training and you're independent, but not. And it's a bridge between being a kid and your parents' house and versus being 100% and, adulting on your own. And that university, because like when I look at the collapse one where it just doesn't work, okay, that ain't going to happen.
Right.
It's just not, it's not going to happen.
Right.
Not in 10 years, no way. There's way too many rich alumni that would make sure their university stays open. On the other hand, some of the other stuff like degree alternative plans and some of the stuff like that, yeah, that could be integrated in with the traditional college. So I don't know, it's interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. And just maybe to see like what kind of mesh we have of these different scenarios over the next 8 years and to see where we're at in 2030.
Yeah.
Yes. I feel like some of them were very extreme and how how you said, Michelle, like for like a collapse that happened in 10 years, like what, it doesn't really seem very realistic to me, but I'm like, not that I know about these scenarios, it's something that I'm always going to be like thinking back in the future and be like, is it close to any of them?
Yeah. For sure.
Yes. Well, thank you guys for another wonderful recording.